So you wake up in the morning, right? You roll over, grab your smartphone, and you tap that little weather icon on the screen.
Right. The very first thing most of us do.
Exactly. And instantly, there it is. You get this clean, minimalist interface telling you it's going to be, exactly 72 degrees today with a 10% chance of rain at 3 in the afternoon.
Yeah, and it feels like a mathematical certainty. I mean, the numbers are rendered in this crisp typography, and we find that deeply comforting. We just naturally gravitate toward systems that categorize the world and present it without any ambiguity.
It feels like clean engineering, like it's just binary. But that feeling of clean, crisp engineering just completely vanishes the moment you pull back the curtain on how that 72-degree forecast actually gets to your phone.
Oh, it completely evaporates.
Right, because you step into the world of federal earth science, and suddenly you're not looking at some sterile laboratory. You're looking at a landscape that is incredibly messy, deeply territorial, and driven by decades of bureaucratic warfare.
Bureaucratic warfare is honestly the best way to describe it.
Yeah. So today, we are doing a deep dive into a historical dossier titled The Wet NASA, A Source Dossier. And we're tracking the birth of an agency that you rely on every single day, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or, NOAA.
And this dossier provides a really granular look at NOAA's institutional history, specifically focusing on its founding back in 1970.
Right.
So the mission of our analysis today is to break down how three distinct, deeply entrenched, century-old scientific rivals were forcefully fused together into a single federal agency.
Shoved under one roof.
Basically, yeah. We're examining the bureaucratic stakes of that massive merger, the intense culture clashes, and really the fundamental question of why a government office dedicated purely to, quote-unquote, understanding the environment struggles so much to defend its existence in a congressional budget meeting.
Because, we all rely on the weather forecast. Every commercial airline pilot charting a flight path, every farmer deciding when to plant crops, or just, every commuter deciding whether to grab an umbrella.
Absolutely. Everyone uses it.
But the agency behind it all, NOAA, it was born from this forced bureaucratic marriage, and it was shoved into the Department of Commerce. And the wild thing is, it was explicitly modeled after NASA right at the height of the space race.
But it never got NASA's budget.
Right. Never got the budget, never got the independence. So to understand why this merger was deemed necessary in the first place, we really have to look at the fragmented landscape of environmental science in the 1960s.
Yeah, the federal government in the 1960s was just completely decentralized when it came to earth science. If we survey the landscape of that era, environmental research was scattered across entirely unrelated departments.
It was a mess. Imagine trying to run a business where the departments don't just sit in different buildings, but they don't even speak the same language. You have the people studying the weather and the coastlines over in the Department of Commerce. The people managing commercial fisheries were housed entirely separately in the Department of the Interior.
Right.
And if you wanted to track down ocean research, you had to look at the Navy, the National Science Foundation, the Atomic Energy Commission, and even the Bureau of Mines.
The Bureau of Mines, yeah. And the friction generated by that fragmentation was immense because every single one of these agencies had its own separate budget appropriations line in Congress.
They were competing for money.
Exactly. They reported to different congressional oversight committees. So consequently, they developed completely separate definitions of what the environment even meant based on their own specific departmental mandates.
Because they had to justify their own funding.
Right. So the Navy viewed the ocean as a tactical battle space. The Bureau of Commercial Fisheries viewed it as a biological resource to be harvested. And the Weather Bureau viewed it as a thermodynamic engine driving atmospheric patterns.
So they're all looking at the same ocean but seeing completely different things.
Right. There was zero unified federal strategy because the agencies were effectively competing against one another for funding rather than, collaborating on a comprehensive model of the Earth.
Which means, structurally, if a meteorologist in commerce realized that ocean surface temperatures being mapped by the Navy were actually affecting the weather patterns they were trying to predict.
They couldn't just walk across the hall and share the data.
No. They'd have to navigate all this interdepartmental red tape just to talk about the exact same body of water. But Congress eventually did recognize this dysfunction.
They did, yeah.
In 1966, they passed the Marine Resources and Engineering Development Act, which basically authorized a temporary commission to figure out a long-term unified policy. And in January 1967, President Lyndon B. Johnson appointed Julius Adam Stratton to chair this commission.
And Julius Adams Stratton was uniquely positioned for this role. I mean, he served as the president of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology from 1959 to 1966.
Oh, wow, MIT.
Yeah, and later he chaired the Ford Foundation. So as a physicist and a communications theorist, he obviously possessed a deep understanding of the scientific method. But more crucially, for this story, Stratton understood the mechanics of Washington.
He knew how to play the game.
Exactly. He knew how to translate abstract scientific ambitions into actionable, legally sound government policy. So by chairing the Commission on Marine Science, Engineering, and Resources, which just became known as the Stratton Commission, he elevated the concerns of the ocean science community to the highest levels of the federal government.
So the Stratton Commission spends 2 years basically gathering data, interviewing scientists, and trying to untangle this massive bureaucratic web. And in January 1969, just days before the presidential transition, they deliver this massive final report to Congress titled Our Nation and the Sea, a Plan for National Action.
And it was comprehensive.
Yeah, it contained over 120 formal recommendations. It detailed strategies for resource development, coastal pollution management, and centrally, a massive reorganization of the federal bureaucracy.
Right, that was the big one.
Their primary recommendation was the creation of a unified, independent, cabinet-level civilian agency dedicated to the ocean and atmosphere.
Because the cultural context of the late 1960s heavily influenced this recommendation. NASA was demonstrating the sheer power of a focused, independent civilian agency.
I mean, they were going to the moon.
Exactly. The Apollo program was operating with a clear mandate and a massive budget. So the Stratton Commission looked at the success of the space program and posed a structural question. Could the United States apply that exact same concentrated, well-funded organizational model to the oceans?
And that implicit question birthed the defining phrase of this whole era, which is the wet NASA.
A wet NASA.
The Commission explicitly modeled their proposed ocean agency on the space agency. And it's a super compelling visual. You look at the Apollo program with its Saturn V rockets and these massive mission control rooms, and you propose doing the exact same thing, but pointing the focus downward into the oceans.
And that wet NASA framing was a deliberate strategy. It was aspirational framing to harness the political momentum of the space race. Advocates for this new ocean agency really sought 3 specific institutional advantages that NASA possessed.
Okay, what were they?
First, a single, unbroken chain of command, which would eliminate all that interdepartmental squabbling we talked about. Second, the prestige of being an independent agency reporting directly to the president.
Cabinet level.
Yeah, right. And third, funding parity.
Mm-hmm.
Just ensuring that the exploration of the Earth's oceans received the same financial backing as the exploration of the lunar surface.
But see, I look at that wet NASA analogy, and I think it carries a fundamental structural flaw right out of the gate. Think about the physical realities of space versus the ocean.
Okay.
Space is a vacuum.
Yeah.
It's an empty void. The operational goal is just to achieve the velocity necessary to reach it, survive the environment, and, maybe plant a flag or collect a rock. The ocean, however, is this heavily utilized, deeply complex ecosystem sitting right in our backyard. In the 1960s, we were already routing global shipping lanes across it, dragging commercial fishing nets through it, and dumping industrial pollution into it.
That's a huge distinction.
Space is a distant frontier we were visiting. But the ocean is an active system we're already exploiting. So setting up the expectation of a moonshot for oceanography seems like a complete misdiagnosis of what the actual scientific challenge is.
And that highlights the exact limit of the blueprint the Stratton Commission created. Because you're right, the term wet NASA successfully captured the public imagination, and it definitely generated initial political capital. But it promised an operational reality that Earth science can literally never deliver.
Because it's not a destination.
Exactly. NASA's early missions were destination-driven, and achieving a destination like landing on the moon produces a highly visible binary result. You either landed or you didn't.
Everyone can watch it on TV and cheer.
Right. The public and politicians can easily understand and celebrate a successful landing. But NOAA's envisioned mission was systemic understanding. The Earth's climate and oceanic systems are so staggeringly complex that total comprehension is basically impossible.
It's never done.
Right. An Earth science agency does not plant a flag. It continuously refines a mathematical model. It measures subtle shifts in temperature, tracks nutrient cycles, maps fluid dynamics. Both endeavors are vital, obviously, but refining a climate model over a 50-year period is completely invisible to the public compared to a televised rocket launch.
So because the Stratton Commission was just an advisory board, their massive blueprint was effectively just a wish list. To make it a reality, the incoming president, Richard Nixon, had to figure out how to actually bypass a gridlocked Congress to restructure the executive branch.
And he found a loophole.
He did. And that loophole was triggered on a single historic day, July 9, 1970. On this single day, President Nixon sent two separate reorganization plans to Congress. Reorganization Plan Number 3 proposed the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and Reorganization Plan Number 4 proposed NOAA.
And the simultaneous creation of the EPA and NOAA presents a really complex historical picture. From an objective historical standpoint, Nixon's motives are heavily debated among scholars.
Because of his later reputation.
Right. We have to be completely impartial here and note that some historians interpret this dual creation as evidence of a genuine, if pragmatic, commitment to environmental management during his early presidency.
Okay, and the other side.
Others view it purely as opportunistic bureaucratic tidying, like an effort to streamline the executive branch by consolidating the sprawling environmental programs he inherited from the Johnson administration, completely detached from any ideological environmentalism.
Just cleaning house.
Exactly. So that's an open historical question. But regardless of his underlying motive, the mechanical execution of this consolidation relied on a very specific legal tool.
Right. Let's break down the mechanics of that executive strategy. Because Nixon utilized the Reorganization Act of 1949. If a president tries to create a new federal agency through standard legislation, a bill has to be drafted, debated in committees, subjected to amendments, and passed by both the House and the Senate.
It's a nightmare.
Yeah. Every legislator has the opportunity to strip out bureaus they dislike or attach funding for their own pet projects in their home districts. It's a slow, highly vulnerable process. By using the Reorganization Act, Nixon deployed a blunt, bureaucratic instrument that completely circumvented standard legislative procedures.
And the mechanism of the Reorganization Act is what made it so effective. Under this law, the president drafted a comprehensive reorganization plan and transmitted it to Congress. And once transmitted, a 60-day clock began ticking.
Just a countdown.
Literally a countdown. The plan would automatically take effect at the end of those 60 days unless either chamber of Congress passed a formal resolution of disapproval.
Wait, automatically?
Automatically. And crucially, Congress was legally barred from amending the plan.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they could not approve the merger of the Weather Bureau, but then reject the inclusion of the Fisheries Bureau. It forced a straight up or down vote on the entire package.
It's all or nothing.
All or nothing. By imposing this rigid framework, Nixon insulated the delicate, highly contested merger of these scientific agencies from congressional micromanagement.
That is a masterstroke. So when Nixon transmitted Reorganization Plan Number 4, his message to Congress established the foundational charter for NOAA. He stated the reorganization was necessary for, and I'm quoting here, better protection of life and property from natural hazards, for a better understanding of the total environment, for exploration and development leading to the intelligent use of marine resources.
A better understanding of the total environment. That became their core mandate.
Exactly. And Congress did not vote to disapprove the plan within the 60-day window. So on paper, NOAA became a reality.
But, as we know, an agency cannot function purely as a legal abstraction.
Right. People actually have to go to work.
Exactly. Nixon's maneuver created NOAA's organizational chart, but on October 3, 1970, the actual implementation began. The personnel who comprised this new agency had to occupy physical offices, establish communication protocols, and figure out how to operate as a single entity.
Because Reorganization Plan Number 4 did not authorize a massive hiring wave to staff a brand new building. It forced a merger of existing institutions, and these were not minor contemporary offices. We are looking at three distinct scientific tribes, deeply entrenched in their own methodologies, some with lineages stretching back over a century.
Oh, the history here is wild.
Let's look at the three primary groups that were forced to integrate, because their historical identities explain the intense friction that followed. The first component was the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey. This agency was established in 1807 during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. Right. To put that in perspective, 1807 is just 2 years after the Lewis and Clark expedition returned from the Pacific coast.
That is incredible context. And Congress authorized the survey specifically to map the nation's treacherous coastlines and harbors to facilitate safe maritime commerce.
Because ships kept wrecking.
Exactly. By 1970, it had operated continuously for 163 years, making it the oldest continuous federal scientific mandate in the United States. I mean, its surveyors had operated through the Civil War. They utilized 19th century triangulation methods, literally dragging heavy chains and transit theodolites across coastal swamps.
Doing the grueling physical labor of mapping.
Yes. And eventually, they evolved to use sonar and aerial photogrammetry. The Coast Survey possessed a deeply ingrained, highly disciplined culture rooted in precise measurement and cartography. Their professional identity was built entirely around physical surveying.
Okay, so that is the first group, the surveyors. Proud, established, mapping-focused. The second foundational pillar was the U.S. Weather Bureau, founded in 1870. And their institutional history involves just constantly being shuffled around the government.
They could never stay in one place.
No. They originated within the Army Signal Corps, which makes sense given that early weather forecasting relied heavily on telegraph networks to transmit rudimentary atmospheric data.
Right, the military had the telegraphs.
Then in 1891, they were transferred to the Department of Agriculture, reflecting the importance of weather to crop yields. Finally, in 1940, they moved to the Department of Commerce, reflecting the growing importance of aviation and commercial forecasting.
Right, flights need weather data.
Exactly. By the time of the 1970 merger, the Weather Bureau was a sprawling, fast-paced operational network. They managed thousands of surface stations, launched upper-air radiosondes, weather balloons, coordinated Hurricane Hunter aircraft, and were deeply involved in managing early meteorological satellites.
So they represented the second group, the meteorologists. Their culture was defined by operational urgency, physics, and fluid dynamics. They operated on rigid daily deadlines because, let's face it, a forecast is totally useless if it is delivered late.
Right, you can't be late on the weather.
Exactly.
Oh.
The third major component, however, came from an entirely different sector of the government. The Bureau of Commercial Fisheries traced its origins to the U.S. Fish Commission, established in 1871 to investigate the collapse of commercial fish stocks along the New England coast.
The biological side.
Right. And, crucially, until the 1970 reorganization, they were housed within the Department of the Interior.
Okay, so that is the third group, the biologists. So we have the 163-year-old nautical map makers who meticulously chart static coastlines. We have the physicists and meteorologists running high-speed fluid dynamic equations to predict chaotic atmospheric changes within a 24-hour window. And we have marine biologists studying complex long-term ecological interactions and population dynamics of fish.
And Nixon's plan just shoved them all into the same organizational structure.
And mandated that they function as a unified agency.
Right. And the workplace culture clash was immediate and severe. It wasn't merely a matter of adjusting to new letterhead on the stationery. It was a collision of fundamentally different scientific philosophies. How did that play out? Well, the most profound divide existed between the physical scientists, so the meteorologists and oceanographers who viewed the environment through the lens of thermodynamics and physics, and the biological scientists from the Fisheries Bureau, who viewed the environment through the lens of ecology and living organisms.
The day-to-day friction must have been immense. Because, think about it. A physical oceanographer looking at an ocean current sees a vector of energy transport, measured in terms of temperature gradients and salinity.
Right, it's just math to them.
Right. But a fisheries biologist looking at that exact same current sees a nutrient delivery system governing the spawning cycles of pelagic fish. They are literally observing the same physical space, but measuring completely different metrics, speaking different scientific languages, and publishing in different journals.
And beyond the scientific divide, the bureaucratic trauma of the merger heavily impacted the fisheries division in particular, because relocating an entire bureau from the Department of the Interior over to the Department of Commerce involves severing decades of established administrative support, funding pipelines, and internal communication networks.
You're uprooting their entire operational life.
Completely. Bureaucratically, transferring a division across cabinet-level departments is incredibly difficult. And historically, the fisheries mission has continually experienced a degree degree of isolation within NOAA, precisely because NOAA's overarching corporate culture became heavily dominated by the physical sciences, weather, and atmospheric physics.
We also have to consider the human element here, specifically the ego and the status involved. On October 2, 1970, certain individuals held the title of Director of the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey, or Director of the U.S. Weather Bureau.
Massive historical prestige.
Right. But on October 3, those autonomous agencies ceased to exist as top-level entities. They were demoted to sub-agencies within NOAA. The leadership of these legacy institutions suddenly found their titles diminished, reporting to a new layer of administration. The personnel had to navigate the psychological loss of their historic identities and attempt to integrate into a completely unproven, hybridized organization.
Managing that kind of integration required a very specific type of leadership. And that task fell to Robert M. White, who was appointed as NOAA's first administrator.
Who was he?
White possessed a background uniquely suited to this exact problem. He was an accomplished meteorologist who had actually served as the director of the U.S. Weather Bureau from 1963 to 1965. Following that, he became the director of the Environmental Science Services Administration, or ESSA.
Wait, ESSA is a crucial piece of this puzzle, right?
It is, because in 1965, Reorganization Plan No. 2 had already merged the Weather Bureau and the Coast and Geodetic Survey together under the Commerce Department to form ESA.
Oh, so they'd already done a mini-merger.
Exactly. When NOAA was created in 1970, the roughly 10,000 employees of ESSA constituted about 70% of NOAA's starting workforce. So Robert White had already spent 5 years managing the friction between the meteorologists and the surveyors.
He knew exactly what he was walking into.
He did. He had personally overseen the institutional precursors to NOAA. When he assumed the role of NOAA administrator, his primary challenge was stabilizing the psychology of a fractured territorial workforce. The dossier outlines how White spent the initial 7 years of his tenure meticulously building NOAA's internal cohesion and external credibility.
How did he do that?
He understood that a newly patched-together agency, lacking the historical armor of its predecessors, was highly vulnerable to political interference and budget cuts. His strategy was to establish NOAA as an unassailable authority on environmental data. By demanding rigorous scientific excellence, he essentially weaponized their data quality as a shield against political headwinds.
But White's intense focus on building that defensive credibility was fundamentally required because of a major compromise embedded in the very reorganization plan that created the agency.
Right, the original sin of NOAA.
Exactly. For all the ambitious rhetoric generated by the Stratton Commission regarding a wet NASA, Reorganization Plan No. 4 completely ignored the Commission's most critical recommendation. The Stratton Commission explicitly called for an independent cabinet-level agency. Nixon's plan instead placed NOAA entirely inside the Department of Commerce.
And the placement of an agency within the federal architecture totally dictates its operational reality. The Department of Commerce is the cabinet department responsible for economic growth.
Right.
It houses the Patent and Trademark Office, the Census Bureau, the International Trade Administration. The Secretary of Commerce advises the president on trade deficits, industrial policy, corporate regulations. The primary constituents influencing the Commerce Department are chambers of commerce, manufacturing lobbyists, and business executives.
Not marine biologists.
Earth scientists and marine biologists do not hold natural influence in those corridors at all.
So if placing an environmental science agency inside the Department of Commerce creates such a massive misalignment of priorities, why did the Nixon administration choose that specific location?
The decision was driven almost entirely by bureaucratic pragmatism. As we noted, ESSA already accounted for 70% of the personnel and infrastructure that would make up NOAA, and ESSA was already housed within the Commerce Department.
Oh, so it was just the path of least resistance.
Pretty much. From the perspective of the Nixon administration, placing NOAA in commerce required the least amount of structural disruption. It was administratively clean. However, while it minimized immediate logistical headaches, it permanently kneecapped NOAA's political power.
Because NOAA is not an independent agency, its administrator does not have a seat at the president's cabinet table. Robert White couldn't simply request a meeting in the Oval Office to advocate for oceanographic funding. He had to funnel all his requests through the Secretary of Commerce.
Which is a huge bottleneck.
Right. And when a federal budget is being negotiated, a Commerce Secretary is rarely going to expend their finite political capital fighting for deep-sea research funding when they are simultaneously fighting over massive international trade agreements or domestic manufacturing subsidies.
And the scientific community recognized this structural deficit almost immediately. The dossier references an article published in the journal Science in 1971.
So just 1 year after the agency was established.
Just 1 year. The headline summarized the grim realization: NOAA and oceanographic research, wet NASA idea dries up.
Ouch.
Yeah, within 12 months, it became glaringly apparent to the scientific establishment that the actual appropriations granted by Congress would never align with the expansive, well-funded vision proposed by the Stratton Commission.
If we look for an analogy to explain the gap between the promise of a wet NASA and the reality of being placed in the Commerce Department, it's like imagine you are a highly skilled civil engineer. The government recruits you, promising that you will be in charge of designing and building a massive, transformative new interstate highway system from scratch. You accept the job, fully expecting to manage heavy machinery, direct large-scale concrete pours, and cut ribbons on massive bridges.
Sounds great.
But on your first day, you realize you haven't been assigned to a new infrastructure department. You've been assigned to a desk at the Department of Motor Vehicles, and your daily task is processing license renewals and calculating vehicle registration fees.
That is painfully accurate.
You are technically still working in transportation, but you are buried deep within an administrative bureaucracy, completely starved of the capital needed to actually build the highway you were promised.
That analogy perfectly isolates the disparity in operational capacity. A mandate to explore the environment requires capital-intensive infrastructure. We're talking research vessels, supercomputers, satellite arrays. When you are buried in an unrelated department, competing for funds against entirely different operational mandates, that infrastructure is the first thing to be compromised.
It's the first thing cut.
Every time. And this fundamental vulnerability regarding visibility and funding did not just define NOAA's relationship with the rest of the government. It actually created a permanent structural conflict within NOAA itself.
Yeah, because on the exact same day NOAA was established, October 3rd, 1970, the agency also stood up its internal research and development branch, the Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research, or OAR.
OAR, right.
The dossier indicates that OAR was the component of NOAA that most closely aligned with the original wet NASA aspiration, but it was also the least visible to the public. They recruited prominent scientists like oceanographer Harris B. Stewart, Jr., who established the Atlantic Oceanographic and Meteorological Laboratory, AOML, down in Miami.
Right.
By 1973, they established the Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory, PMEL, in the Pacific Northwest. And in 1974, they formed the Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory, GLER, under the direction of Eugene Uber.
And the establishment of OAR formalized a division of labor that generated immediate and lasting bureaucratic friction. We have to analyze how NOAA is structurally partitioned, because the vast majority of the agency consists of what are designated as line offices. These are the operational divisions interacting directly with the public and industry. So the National Weather Service, the National Marine Fisheries Service, and the National Ocean Service. OAR sits entirely separate from these operational line offices, functioning purely as a research arm.
To understand why this division causes so much friction during budget cycles, we can look at a mechanical analogy. Imagine a massive commercial bakery.
Okay, I'm with you.
The line offices, like the Weather Service, are the bakers on the floor. Their mandate is to get 5,000 loaves of bread baked, bagged, and loaded onto the delivery trucks by 4:00 a.m. every single morning. They operate on strict deadlines, and their success is measured by output.
Tangible output.
Tangible output. OAR, however, is the test kitchen located in the back of the building. The personnel in the test kitchen are not baking bread for today's deliveries. They are spending 5 years crossbreeding a new strain of drought-resistant wheat so that the bakery can continue to operate 10 years from now when the climate changes.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Both functions are completely necessary for the long-term survival of the business, but they require entirely different resources and timelines.
And that analogy perfectly illustrates the political dynamic of counting versus understanding. Line offices produce concrete, quantifiable deliverables that politicians can easily cite during committee hearings.
They can point to a number.
Right. The Weather Service can testify that they issued 4,000 severe thunderstorm warnings, directly saving lives. The Fishery Service can report that they surveyed 300 fish stocks, directly supporting the commercial fishing industry. The Ocean Service can point to 200 updated nautical charts, directly preventing cargo ship groundings. These are tangible outputs.
You can count them on a spreadsheet.
Exactly.
But what exactly does the test kitchen produce? OAR's mandate is not to issue a warning, print a chart, or regulate a fishery. Their mandate is to generate pure scientific understanding. They investigate the chemical composition of coastal estuaries, they study the thermodynamic exchange of heat between the ocean surface and the atmosphere, and they build models of long-term climate variability.
Yeah.
They produce understanding. And understanding cannot be easily quantified on a spreadsheet.
And the difficulty of quantifying understanding creates massive political vulnerability due to the mechanics of constituency lobbying. The operational line offices possess incredibly powerful, financially motivated constituencies.
Like who?
When the budget for the National Weather Service is threatened with cuts, the television broadcasting industry, the commercial aviation sector, global shipping conglomerates, and massive agricultural lobbies will immediately pressure their congressional representatives.
Because their bottom line depends on it.
Their profit margins rely explicitly on the daily operational data provided by those line offices.
So if you propose cutting the budget for OAR, who exactly is going to march on Washington to defend understanding the thermodynamic exchange of the air-sea interface?
Nobody.
The constituencies for basic research are limited to universities, cooperative institutes, and the academic scientists themselves. And functionally speaking, research scientists do not possess the political leverage, the lobbying infrastructure, or the capital to effectively pressure congressional appropriations committees.
Consequently, when the federal budget tightens and the Secretary of Commerce mandates agency-wide reductions, pure research is always the most politically viable target for cuts.
It's the lowest hanging fruit.
Exactly. This dynamic institutionalizes the practice of budget rating. The dossier explicitly notes the chronic internal friction caused by this reality. In years with flat or reduced budgets, funding originally allocated for long-term OAR research projects is frequently cannibalized to maintain the immediate operational readiness of the line offices. The prevailing bureaucratic logic dictates that you can safely delay a 10-year study on ocean currents, but you absolutely cannot shut down a Doppler radar station during tornado season.
Right. So if we look at this from the perspective of a pragmatic congressional appropriator trying to balance a budget, a logical question arises. If OAR's product is invisible to the public, lacks political defense, and is constantly getting its budget rated to support the line offices anyway, why maintain a separate research arm at all?
It's a fair question.
Why not simply dissolve OAR, distribute its funding, and mandate that the Weather Bureau and the Fisheries Service conduct their own internal research?
Because the mechanics of operational mandates completely prohibit long-term innovation. If you dissolve OAR and direct the National Weather Service to manage its own research budget, the operational urgency of their mandate will consume every available dollar.
They'll just spend it on today's problems.
They will inevitably spend 100% of their research capital on incremental improvements to immediate problems, for instance, trying to make the 24-hour hurricane track projection slightly more accurate. They are legally obligated to prioritize tomorrow's forecast.
Right.
They will never authorize funding for a massive decade-long study into deep ocean salinity gradients because it does not help them issue a warning tomorrow morning. OAR exists specifically to investigate the complex, foundational questions that the operational agencies lack the mandate, the time, and the freedom to explore.
They ask the questions no one else is asking.
Exactly. OAR generates the basic scientific understanding that 10 or 20 years in the future becomes the foundational architecture for the next generation of operational forecasts.
The long-term payoffs of that basic research are the ultimate defense for OAR's existence. When we examine what those research laboratories actually achieved once they were established, the profound value of invisible science becomes clear.
Let's look at some examples.
The dossier details several critical victories. Let's look at the Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory, GLERL, established in 1974. In its early years, GLERL directed significant research into the mechanics of phosphorus loading in the Great Lakes Basin.
And this is a perfect example of foundational understanding driving vital policy. GLERL researchers weren't issuing daily water quality forecasts. They were meticulously studying the biological and chemical mechanisms of eutrophication.
Which is what exactly?
Basically, they tracked how agricultural runoff containing high levels of phosphorus entered the lakes. They documented how that excess phosphorus triggered massive, explosive blooms of algae.
And the mechanism of the damage isn't just the algae itself, right? When those massive algal algal blooms inevitably die off, the bacteria that decompose the dead algae consume vast amounts of dissolved oxygen in the water.
Yes.
That process creates enormous hypoxic zones, dead zones, where the oxygen levels are too low to support aquatic life, leading to massive fish kills and the collapse of the local ecosystem.
And GLERL developed complex models demonstrating exactly how nutrient runoff was driving this systemic collapse. That research was the definition of pure understanding. But that exact scientific understanding was subsequently utilized by the International Joint Commission to establish strict, legally binding limits on nutrient runoff across the region.
A line office wouldn't have done that.
A purely operational forecasting office would never have possessed the mandate to conduct that foundational ecological modeling, yet it was absolutely essential for the survival of the Great Lakes ecosystem.
We see the exact same dynamic with the Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory, PMAL. The dossier highlights their role in developing the Tropical Atmosphere Ocean Array, known as the TAO array. This involved deploying a massive network of highly sophisticated telemetry buoys across the equatorial Pacific Ocean.
Just an enormous undertaking.
Yeah, these buoys were engineered to survive the brutal physical environment of the open ocean while continuously measuring surface winds, sea surface temperatures, and subsurface temperatures down to a depth of 500 meters.
And deploying and maintaining that array was a massive logistical and scientific challenge. It was basic research into the mechanics of ocean monitoring, but the data generated by those buoys revealed the thermodynamic coupling between the Pacific Ocean and the global atmosphere. The TAO array became the critical mechanism for identifying the onset and intensity of El Niño southern oscillation events.
And the ability to predict El Niño is incredibly valuable. When the TAO array detects the specific subsurface warming patterns indicative of El Niño, that pure scientific data is handed over to the operational line offices.
Right, they hand it off.
The Weather Service uses it to predict shifts in global jet streams, which translates directly into forecasts of severe drought in Australia or massive rainfall in California. That forecast allows agricultural sectors to adjust their crop planting strategies months in advance, stabilizing food prices and protecting the economy.
It's all connected.
Without PMEL doing the foundational, undefendable basic research to build the buoy array in the first place, the Weather Service would be completely blind to those global disruptions.
And this capacity to deliver hard, unvarnished scientific truths was exactly what Robert White intended when he sought to establish NOAA's credibility. The dossier notes that during the 1970s, White was already publicly issuing warnings about the long-term implications of anthropogenic climate change.
Which could not have been popular.
No. Delivering warnings about the atmospheric accumulation of carbon dioxide was not a politically convenient narrative, particularly for an agency housed within the business-centric Department of Commerce.
But White understood that the ultimate value of NOAA, the core justification for its existence, was its mandate to monitor the total environment. By unflinchingly reporting the data regarding climate change, even when it contradicted the economic priorities of its parent department, NOAA cemented its reputation as an objective scientific authority.
Yet, despite the massive successes of the TAO array, the Great Lakes modeling, and the establishment of climate monitoring, the structural vulnerability engineered into NOAA back in 1970 remains unresolved today.
And never went away.
Never. The agency is still tasked with generating infinite understanding while operating within the constraints of a department focused on commerce, forever lacking the independent prestige of a NASA.
And the consequences of that structural weakness are super insidious. Because when OAR's budget for basic research is slowly eroded over a decade, the agency doesn't go bankrupt on paper. The failure remains hidden until it manifests as a catastrophic operational deficit in the real world.
Exactly. The failure of invisible science only becomes visible during a disaster.
Right.
It manifests as a hurricane track forecast that lacks precision because the funding for next-generation supercomputer modeling was deferred 5 years ago. It manifests as an El Niño warning that arrives too late for the agricultural sector to mitigate crop losses because maintenance on the ocean buoy array was delayed.
Or storm surge model.
Or it manifests as a localized coastal storm surge model that simply does not exist when a municipality is facing a landfalling hurricane because the research grant to develop that specific coastal topography model was cannibalized to keep the daily weather balloon launches funded. The absence of pure understanding eventually inevitably degrades the operational outputs that society relies upon to survive.
Which brings this entire sprawling history of 1970s bureaucratic warfare directly back to you, the listener. The next time you open the weather app on your phone and look at that clean, precise 72-degree forecast, consider the vast, invisible machinery required to produce that single number.
It's staggering when you think about it.
That simple digital output is the culmination of decades of intense battles over federal appropriations. It is the legacy of three fiercely proud, century-old scientific tribes, surveyors, meteorologists, and biologists, learning to integrate their distinct views of the physical world. It is the result of dedicated personnel fighting relentlessly in obscure congressional subcommittees to defend the intrinsic value of basic scientific research against the constant demand for immediate operational deliverables.
We have spent this deep dive analyzing the labyrinthine federal bureaucracy of the 1960s, the strategic calculations behind President Nixon's reorganization plans, and the ongoing structural conflict between funding pure understanding versus tangible outputs. We've traced the lineage from Thomas Jefferson's coastal mapping initiatives to the Stratton Commission's ambitious, unfulfilled vision of a wet NASA.
We want to leave you with a final thought to consider as you navigate the modern world. We have discussed the immense difficulty of defending pure understanding within the fields of oceanography and atmospheric science. But the reliance on invisible science extends far beyond the weather forecast.
So much further.
Consider the lithium-ion battery powering your smartphone, the advanced materials used in modern medical implants, or the genetic sequencing techniques protecting the global agricultural supply. All of these modern necessities are built upon foundational, unglamorous basic research.
Decades ago, someone had to fight a brutal, bureaucratic battle to secure funding for that raw scientific inquiry long before anyone could conceptualize a profitable commercial application.
Exactly. So as you look at the technological infrastructure of your daily life, ask yourself, what other crucial forms of foundational understanding are currently struggling to survive in a laboratory right now simply because the research cannot plant a flag on the moon to capture the public's attention?
It is a critical question about how we as a society choose to value and fund the exploration of the unknown.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the history of NOAA. Keep questioning the unseen infrastructure and the hidden histories behind the everyday data you consume. Because behind every clean, precise interface, there is an incredibly complex, deeply human story waiting to be understood. We will catch you next time.